Good morning. My name is Victor Abraham and I will be your MC upstairs later on today. But now, let me welcome the first night on the Hacktivity stage. Sir David Pepper was the director of the government communications headquarters at the UK's agency responsible for signals intelligence and electronic information security. He is currently a member of the board at Tails UK and works with Deloitte on cyber risk and national security issues. In his talk, Sir Pepper will present the evolution of cyberspace and speak about the coming trends. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome on stage Sir David Pepper.
Sir David Pepper. Thank you, Richard. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for inviting me to be here. My talk is a PowerPoint-free zone for a change. As Victor said, I'm going to talk about evolution in a very particular way. I'm not going to talk about technology. I'm not a technologist. I want to talk about the people and the organizations who are involved in some of the activities that most people in this room spend their time thinking about and working on. I've called my talk Cyberspace and Beyond, Evolution in Action. And that headline is intended to make 2 points, really. The first is the fairly obvious one, that the struggle between malware and attempts to counter it is a form of arms race that can be compared in many ways to the process of evolution. There's a battle for survival with measures and countermeasures being taken in response to each other. The second point is perhaps less obvious. The evolution we see is not confined to cyberspace, but appears also in the real world of people and organizations, and in the way they behave. Moreover, I think the pressures that drive the evolution I'm talking about arise primarily in this real world rather than in cyberspace itself. So what I want to do is try to explore these processes and to focus in particular on the way people and organizations have to develop if they're to survive and prosper in a world increasingly dominated by the internet. I should perhaps say the analogy with evolution is not a precise one. There's all sorts of ways in which you can demolish it, I think. But I think it leads to an interesting analysis of the pressures involved and of their consequences for people and organizations. So that's what I'm going to try to explore. I'll probably link back once or twice to things that Jeff was saying earlier. I was very struck listening to Jeff, firstly by how much he sounded very much like some of my former colleagues in the intelligence and security world, but also because a number of the points he was making will link to some of the things I want to say about people and organizations and the way they operate. So although we have not in any way colluded in preparing our talks, I found a number of points in which they link. I want to start by running through the main categories of threat actors, the people who are generating these threats. I think this is important because it seems to me if we want to analyze the consequences of the activity, we have to understand their purpose and what people are trying to achieve, and what the motivation is of the people who are creating them. So the most obvious place to start, I think, is with cybercrime, by which I mean any form of financial theft or fraud. It can be directed against individuals, such as attempts to get banking details through phishing or whatever technique. Or the victims could be companies, which means potentially any company doing business over the internet. Or the target can be the state. For example, criminals might be using the internet to try to commit benefit fraud. And as we know, the sums of money involved are huge, and I don't believe any of the estimates that one hears in any detail at all, but we're obviously talking tens or even hundreds of billions of dollars a year, so big business. That's cybercrime. My second category is cyber espionage, by which I mean countries trying to obtain other countries' secrets over the internet. Now, it strikes me that this approach to espionage is really no different in principle from all the old-fashioned approaches of trying to obtain information and secrets by perhaps burgling an office or recruiting a spy or trying to blackmail somebody. The object is very similar. The object is identical. And there's a lot of similarity in the techniques. Again, it come out very clearly in Jeff's talk. His list of things that you have to do could have been the list of anybody who was using old-fashioned espionage techniques before they could make any progress. But the cyber approach does have a number of significant advantages over the old-fashioned approaches. There's the huge amount of material available online, for example. There's a very large number of alternative routes that are available, all the possible personal email addresses that you could go in through, as well as just directly into the official repositories. Your chances of getting caught are probably smaller, and if you are caught, using all the techniques that Jeff talked about and that you all are familiar with, that it can make it virtually impossible for the victim to prove your identity. Whereas if you're caught burgling an office, it's quite hard to deny that you are who you are. But the motivation behind the conventional and the cybercrime, I think, are essentially the same. An important variant of this, which I think is very important these days, is industrial espionage, by which I mean companies having their commercial secrets stolen. I think most of the same points that I've talked about for espionage apply also to commercial espionage, including the advantages. A country that wants to steal the commercial secrets of another country may be able to do so more easily and more safely by exploiting its target's poor online security than by burglary or bribery. And of course, any company that has its internal processes in any way exposed to the internet is potentially vulnerable. The two areas that I've talked about as distinct of state espionage and commercial espionage overlap if we get to the area of defense industries. A state that wants to get another country's defense secrets may actually find it much easier to do that by going in through the networks of the defense industry rather than by trying to go in through to its Ministry of Defense, for example. Now, we know that these problems of espionage, whether commercial or defense or industrial, are real and serious. For a long time, and certainly for quite a lot of the latter part of my career, this was not really taken seriously. It was seen as a problem that the spooks had invented, that the strange geeks in my organisation were worrying about that weren't real. But it suddenly became very clear that they were real. And I think the problem is now taken seriously throughout government and increasingly throughout industry as a real problem. I could also have mentioned the critical national infrastructure as a target. So water and power systems, for example, are certainly of interest to other countries who are interested in information gathering or perhaps making preparation for hostile activity, which I'll come on to. So that's the category of espionage. The next threat in my list is from people who I will group together as hackers and hacktivists. So I'm grouping together people who might attack personal or corporate IT systems just for fun, just to prove how clever they are, and people who do so for a political or an ideological motive. And in doing this, they may, of course, be seeking to do damage or to block legitimate access or to steal information. The motivations, I think, of the two groups of hackers and hacktivists might be different. One doing it for fun, just to prove they can. The other for political or ideological reasons. But their techniques and I think the effects on their victims are similar. And I suspect there are people who will turn up in both groups. My next category is terrorism. And Jeff talked a bit about cyber jihadists. But so far the world has been spared, I think, what I would truly call cyber terrorism. That is to say, physical effects delivered by terrorists over the internet. I think that's a bit surprising. We know, and you saw a lot of what Jeff was talking about, we know that Al-Qaeda have very considerable IT expertise. They use the internet a great deal. Their use is sophisticated. Operationally, they understand cybersecurity pretty well. But they've not yet chosen to use this expertise offensively. That may, I suppose, be because they have a fixation with bloodshed and with transport systems, or perhaps because it would be too hard for them still to achieve the magnitude of effect, the size of effect that they would like to. But I do believe that at least for purposes of self-protection, nations should be regarding cyber terrorism, at least in the medium term, as a real threat, whether from Al-Qaeda or from some other group. There are other groups around who I'm sure could be doing it. And then my last category of threat is cyber warfare, which is a term that gets used very casually and very loosely. I'm using it to mean attacks by one state to disable or subvert the IT infrastructure of another state. So this definition would include, for example, peacetime events like the denial of service attack on Estonia a few years ago, which was clearly intended to disable the civil government's IT systems. It would include activity by one state to disable an opponent's civil or military systems before or during actual hostilities, as appears to have happened a few years ago before the Russian attack on Georgia. And it would certainly include phenomena like Stuxnet. For me, Stuxnet has two types of strategic significance. First, the fact it's apparently a genuine cyber attack, apparently by one country on another. And secondly, the fact that it attacks control systems which are widely used not only in the manufacture of nuclear material, but also in many aspects of the critical national infrastructure, in power and water control systems, for example. And as far as I know, those two features are both the first time we have observed such things. So those, for me, are the sources of the threats that we're thinking about. Not the technical source, not the technical threats, but the people and what they're trying to achieve. It's worth thinking, I think, briefly about the players on the other side, the victims and the defenders, before we go and think about the dynamics between them. We can start with individual citizens, people who may be the direct victims of criminal activity, or they may be innocent bystanders. They may just happen to have had their credit card details stolen in a raid on a company system. Or they may just be the victims of hackers who fancied attacking them for fun. Then there are the organizations that use the internet for their business. And in this I include all sorts of organizations, so certainly companies, certainly government departments, government agencies, charities, anybody for whom the internet is a mode of doing business. And then my third group in this part is the defenders, the IT security companies and consultancies, the police, the government intelligence and security agencies, all the people who are trying to enable legitimate users of the internet to do so safely. Now, all those groups are directly involved in the struggle in cyberspace. Their roles are different and their motivations are different. But as I'll describe, I think we can examine their behavior in terms of quite a small set of motivations and drivers. So I'm now going to start to think about the process of change and evolution that I mentioned at the start. You can see it in one level in terms of what happens in cyberspace itself, of course. Each new development in malware triggers a response in defensive techniques. And each defensive development, in turn, triggers new developments in attacks and in malware itself. I think for a small minority of attackers, that's probably all there is to it. They're doing it for fun. They have no wider interest beyond trying to show how clever they are to be better than their opponents, and because they get a kick out of it. But that very limited horizon, I think, is not true for the majority of players, for whom essentially the technology is a tool for them to go about various forms of business. So most of the evolutionary battle in cyberspace is driven by real-world pressures and by opposing motives. So if we start with the attackers, the criminals are motivated by simple greed, the motive behind all property crime. The hacktivists will be driven by ideology or politics, for example, a hatred of capitalism, or a particular set of views about Julian Assange, for example. Terrorists, if they do eventually appear in this battle space, will be motivated by a desire to damage or destroy the Western political system. The spies who turn up in cyberspace are working for national security or for some other form of national interest, perhaps to achieve national commercial advantage by acquiring foreign companies' intellectual property. All these motivations drive the attackers to advance their capability and to win the next round in the battle with the defenders. If we turn to the victims of the attacks, I think there are two types of motivation. One is the simple need to use and rely on the internet. This applies to users at all levels. Individual citizens, for example, need to use it for business or for leisure or for personal administration such as banking. Many companies rely on it for essential business functions, from customer access to process control. And governments depend upon it for a similar range of internal processes and for service delivery, increasingly. So all these players will be motivated to invest effort in their defense by their particular needs. And the amount they invest will reflect their assessment of the balance between cost and benefit. And I think that balance is one that's increasingly coming to be understood, particularly by companies, and coming to be a driver for their decision on how much effort they should put into protection. It's not necessarily easy, but I think it's vitally important. The second category of motivation, I think, is found among those who provide or operate the communications that the internet relies on, and those who actually defend it. So I include in this group the communication service providers, the communication companies, internet authorities such as ICANN, government agencies such as police and the intelligence and security agencies, my former colleagues, and indeed the IT security industry. Now in this group, I think the motivating factors are a mixture of professional belief in the need to protect the internet, having responsibility for national security and for the prevention of crime and espionage, and in some cases, of course, simple commercial interest. So that's the two sets of motivating factors on the two sides. And I think what follows from this analysis is the realization that the technical evolution in cyberspace has to be seen as being driven by a whole range of evolutionary change in the organizations concerned. So let me think about some examples of that. Start with some of the attackers, perhaps. Cyber criminals have developed sophisticated organizational structures to manage their capabilities and to turn them into cash. They have ways to buy and sell technology with each other. They have ways to exploit stolen credit card data. They have ways to keep the forces of law and order out of their secrets. And they have ways to build their own communities of trust. Again, this links to what Jeff was talking about. I think it seems a bit odd to talk about trust in the context of criminals, but there's an old English proverb that talks about there being trust among thieves. And it's clear that people in this category do have really very sophisticated mechanisms based upon managing trust to share their skills. And it's interesting, I think, that these techniques and structures have evolved not only in response to pressure from the law enforcers, but they've also drawn very heavily on techniques used by legitimate industries in all sorts of ways. Or if you consider, for example, those responsible for cyber espionage, it's clear, I think, from the scale of espionage attacks using advanced persistent threats, that there's a very large and complex organization behind them, perhaps more than one. To achieve the success they do, they need large numbers of people working cooperatively to understand their targets and to generate and manage the attacks. They rely on a very detailed understanding of their targets and the way they behave, and that knowledge and understanding has to be kept up to date, essentially in real time, because their targets are constantly evolving themselves. So again, technical capability is possible only because of a sophisticated and constantly evolving organization. If I now turn from the attackers to the users and the defenders and think about how they're evolving and how they need to evolve, I think this is most easily tackled by asking, first of all, what risks each group faces and how they can mitigate them. And I think that can be seen then as driving the evolution. So for individuals, the most obvious risk is of being a victim of theft or fraud, of having your bank details stolen through a phishing attack or losing your credit card details or passwords through a keylogger, for example. And there's the risk of being a victim to a hacker who decides to take your systems down just for fun or because he's got a grudge against you. In one sense, mitigation of these risks ought to seem easy. Obvious rules about behaving sensibly, using common sense, I think are easily trotted out. But I don't really think it's as easy as that. I think the rules are probably fine for many users, though they probably won't protect them against the more determined attackers. But I do worry very much about, for example, elderly users of the internet. I'm probably the oldest person in this room, but there are a lot of people a lot older than you who find a lot of this really very confusing and very difficult, but actually have to rely on the internet increasingly to do things or not to be shut out of all sorts of aspects of life. I think this group of people particularly, they're not only the elderly, lots of people who are nowhere near as savvy as the people in this room, I think are very vulnerable to criminals. I think they don't know how to react to unfamiliar events, and I think they don't know how to recognize danger signals. And I think it actually makes it very hard for them to be sensible in the way they're asked to be. My evolutionary point here, I think, is that individuals need to learn not only technical skills, as simply how to browse and do email, for example. They need to develop much deeper skills, and they need to learn new behaviors if they're to be safe. They may, for example, need to develop a predisposition to distrust whatever they come across on the internet, which is not the way they're used to living their lives, and for many people will come with great difficulty. If you turn now to organizations that use the internet for their business, I think there's a considerable list of business risks for them to worry about, whether we're talking government or commercial organizations. Some risks are obvious, of course. They may suffer substantial cash losses through theft and fraud. They may lose valuable information to a foreign government or a company, or through the actions of a hacktivist. And for a company, this information could be commercial intellectual property. For a government, it could be sensitive secrets. Or they could incur huge costs through loss of customer data, such as credit card details. Then there's the risk of reputational damage. For a company trading on the internet or selling services, this could well deter customers. So Sony, for example, discovered a couple of years ago the consequences of being careless. For a technology company, having it demonstrated that your own IT security was poor would not do your own technical reputation or your chances of selling your services any good at all. And for a government, successful cyber attacks could easily endanger public confidence in its ability to deliver services online. And that, I think, is particularly important because most governments these days find not only that their citizens expect online service delivery, but also that they need to do it in order to save money themselves. So I think that's quite a significant factor. There's the risk of a major loss of business as a result of damage to a company website. Or an attacker could cause huge and catastrophic financial damage like that. And then a company could lose its production capability through attacks on its internal processes. So it's a very long list of risks. Enough, I think, to frighten most company boards if they really sit down and think about it properly. And I think that list poses two sorts of challenge to them. The first is the obvious one of how to make their technology stronger. And that, of course, means two things. It has to be secure to keep the hackers out, and it has to be resilient so that systems can withstand, for example, denial of service attacks. And that technical response will normally be an organization's starting point. They will normally turn to the techies and say, what are you going to do to fix it? But I think if companies and organizations stop there, they will almost certainly fail to achieve the security that they really seek. And I think this is the heart of my evolutionary point when I'm thinking about organizations. Because the bigger and much more difficult challenge for them is to change the way they behave, and in many cases to change their culture. So at working level, the people working in the organization may well be their biggest source of weakness. So companies may be full of people who would unthinkingly plug an unknown USB drive into their desktop computer, or they might well visit risky websites. And in all these ways, they will expose their employers to unnecessary risks. So there's a very important feature here of staff education to make sure people understand how they have to behave responsibly in order to protect their organization. But I think most critically, it needs the leadership of the organizations to evolve. Company boards and senior executives who are indeed government ministers and senior civil servants, who are very used to regarding IT as something that the IT department will look after for me that I don't need to worry about, need to understand that they can't do that anymore. They can't regard IT as just something that's over there that somebody else will look after for them. They have to realize that by using IT and the internet in the way they're doing, they are exposing their company not only to huge advantages, but also to huge risks. And they need to engage themselves in understanding those risks and thinking about what can be done. They need to think through the business risks properly in the way that I've just gone through, perhaps. They need then to make informed decisions about how to mitigate them and realize, these are not decisions they can just pass off to their CIO. They need also to think about a very wide range of actions, such as things like backup, things like contingency planning. What will they do if and when they are actually attacked? How will the company respond? What will they do in the first hour? And they need to make sure, these leaders, that their own personal behavior conforms to company policies. So company leaders who happily say these are the rules for the way company has to use IT, but then go off and do something entirely different themselves, I think have to understand that they are completely disabling their policies and their security in that way. So there are big changes needed in behavior and in culture. Companies also need to think about external collaboration, which may in fact be even more difficult. And the driving force here, I think, is the need for collective defense, because a lot of the threats are threats that are in common. And so collaboration and information sharing is essential if companies are going to defend themselves effectively. Now, I know this raises awkward questions. It's understandable that companies don't really want to admit to being the victims of attacks, and they're very reluctant to do so. But I don't think the issue can be avoided. And there's a current development in the UK where our government is currently trying to build mechanisms with companies to facilitate information sharing, to try to enable them to share information without giving away things that they're very sensitive about. I think there's a similar international dimension that needs government leads. Cyberspace is obviously a transnational domain. Cyber threats clearly don't respect international boundaries. And to be effective in countering threats, countries have to collaborate. And again, this raises problems similar to the proposition that companies have to collaborate. Each nation will have secrets that they really don't want to share with others. But I think ways around that have to be found, and this requires a change of attitude and culture. And Hungary clearly is very much at the forefront of efforts to do this, having hosted the latest international conference only the week before last. I think also, final point about governments, is they need to take an active role in improving public education in cyber matters. It seems to me that the behavior and the competence of individuals is a significant factor in the overall national security and vulnerability to cyber threats. But the average, as I've talked about, the average level of understanding among citizens about the threats and how they should behave and respond to them is really pretty low. And I think that's unlikely to change without serious government action. And again, I think that requires an evolutionary change in attitude and approach, very often among governments who really are not used to thinking in that way. Finally, when I think about evolution, let me think about the defenders briefly. The forces of law and order and the industries who develop protective systems. I think the evolutionary path for companies working in this area, developing security solutions, is fairly obvious, and it's not really any different from any other company who's developing a commercial strategy. But I think for government agencies, it's very different. These are mostly organizations with long histories of operating in the world before the internet. They're mostly organizations where they have structures and methods that have worked perfectly well in the past, but don't work well enough in the current age. And they employ people whose skills, I think, do not include the sort of deep familiarity with the internet and the way it works, which is what they need. I do speak from some experience here. My own organization, GCHQ, faced this challenge rather earlier than most, because we had to operate in the environment of world communications. I should explain, my organization was the UK's communications interception agency. So I spent much of my career intercepting foreign communications for purposes of foreign intelligence, which sounded awfully like what Jeff was describing, I have to say. So we were used to operating in the pre-internet world. And then suddenly, just over 10 years ago, this changed really quite fundamentally and radically when the internet started to replace most other forms of communication. And we having initially started with a technology solution to this problem, realized eventually that that wasn't good enough, and we had to go through a complete change in culture and behavior and organization. We had to redesign the organization, we had to redesign the skills that people had, and we had to redesign all our operational processes. Now that's really quite a hard task for an organization to do, and it's one that took us several years to work through, and of course it's never complete, because one feature of the new world is constant and rapid change. And that's an evolutionary challenge that every organization in this area, I think, has to grapple with. And I think you still see many organizations trying to tackle the problem by tackling the technology. And they do that without realizing the deeper change they need in skills and in behavior. And I think success for those who have been successful has come, and will come only when they realize the magnitude of that challenge and the longer term thing they have to do. I think that brings me to the point where I will try to wrap up. I've used the metaphor of evolution to describe what's happening in and around cyberspace, because I think it provides a useful framework for looking at a complex problem. A conventional arms race is driven not by interest primarily in armaments as such, but by political motives in the countries involved. It's part of the struggle for power and supremacy. Cyberspace, I think, is partly different from that, in that there are people, and I suspect there's quite a few in this room, who are interested primarily in the technology, and it's many whose motives don't go beyond that. But the great majority of the developments I've talked about, and the great majority of the developments that affect society, are driven by forces that are perfectly familiar in the real world. They're driven by things like greed and political power. And that, I think, an understanding of that is necessary to understand how the internet is going to evolve and how those people who rely upon it and use it have to evolve if they're to be able to do so safely. I fear this analysis doesn't bring any great hope that the struggle against cybercrime or any other threats will come to an easy end, or indeed will ever come to an end, because cyberspace is merely one location in which the struggle between forces that clearly originate very deep in our personalities and our societies are operating. So I think we have to expect this struggle, this cyber struggle, to last probably as long as cyberspace itself. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions if any arise, but I shall be around if anybody wants to talk to me afterwards. Probably are all ready for your coffee, so I'll vacate the station and say thank you. Thank you very much.